Welcome to Antarctic Stories, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes into the rich world of people who live, work, and undertake daring expeditions in the polar regions. My name is Heather Thorkelson, and I'll be your host today. Today's episode is the second in a two-part series featuring Howard Whelan. If you haven't listened to episode 1, we highly recommend you hit pause and go back to check it out first, even if for no other reason than to hear his incredible bio. I do want to kind of turn our attention back to Antarctica again, because again, there's just so many things that I want to ask you about, and one of them, which I think is really important, is the fact that you were working with Aurora for so long, and they were the first to do ship-based Antarctic mountaineering expeditions, including crossing South Georgia, which was mirroring Shackleton's treacherous journey after his men were stranded on Elephant Island.
Yep.
And so I would love to hear more about what that was like, sort of being on the leading edge of taking essentially tourists on ship-based mountaineering expeditions at the very beginning when no one else had done it before.
Okay. Well, it was, first of all, credit where credit's due. Greg being, one of the sort of finest alpinists of our generation and driven. Bear in mind that Greg, even before he started doing this like many, many years ago, Greg is a geologist by background, and he was a geologist in Antarctica when he just got out of university, So he really had the, he had the experience. And of course, if he's taking people to Antarctica, he is going to take people climbing. And so he really just started. And a lot of the climbs that now, companies who offer it. But Greg, they were putting up the first trips up Mount Scott and things. When I say that, I have to be careful because I am sure British Antarctic Survey guys who were down there for 2.5 years at a stretch, who were, going out and not recording anything, but climbing all sorts of stuff, But anyway, we, for us in our own way. And so when I went down and I was leading trips and we had climbers, and then it was an opportunity to take and to look at something and go, oh, well, okay. And then try and find out if it had been climbed, and if it hadn't, and that's okay too. And then we would go and climb things. And I think for me, one of the best was putting up what was believed to be at the time a new route on Mount Demaria, which was just across the Penola Strait from Vernadsky, and we and we had and other smaller ones, but we had everything had to be done in a day. We couldn't camp out. We didn't have the luxury of sort of there's a whole nother tier of mountains that are still waiting for most of the yacht-based climbers have gone in and climbed, scoop most of those guys up, but it's about, I guess it's about, for me it was more about the feeling of exploring, of trying to work it out. It was like a puzzle that needed to be worked out, and that's what I loved about those trips. The South Georgia stuff was completely different because you had a prescribed route. And Greg was the first ones to start leading trips across that. And then I came along and I had an opportunity to lead 4 trips across, and everyone was different. It's a powerful, depending on the time of season, how big the crevasses are on the Green Glacier, it's committing. Once you cross the Tridents and you get down into the Crean and up in there, the storms that hit are unbelievable. I mean, I've got to say, I think one of the strongest, with the exception of Everest, excuse me, one of the strongest storms I've been in has been on the crossing at Crean Camp, and completely it's the only time I've completely lost a tent. It was an old tent, and all the clients were in the new tent. And it was noisy, and I had the thing tied down with climbing rope and ice walls and everything. And at about 3:30 in the morning, there was just a bang, and I was looking up at moving cloud and starlight, Just going,
You're like, wait a minute, what?
So I just shouted at the other guys, okay, everybody, time to get up, get the stove going.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
but
Oh, that's
we
crazy.
did have fun, and it's incredible. It's incredible to see how the change that just how the glaciers have changed. Clearly when you're in King Haakon Bay, and you're down near Peggotty Bluff, and you can read, Shackleton's account how they would dodge the ice cliffs to get around to where they started the trip from Peggotty up to the head of King Haakon Bay and then up. They were having to dodge waves smashing against the ice cliffs in the water, and even 10 or 15 years ago, those ice cliffs were a couple of kilometers up the hill. And also when you're like Crane Glacier and some of them, you in one of the trips or two of the trips, it's almost like the glaciers have receded so much that you're not having to find your way through these big ice falls and crevasse areas. Sometimes you're just walking and jumping over, but it just changes every year. But it's
Yeah.
it is,
Yeah, I can imagine.
yeah.
And what you mentioned about being in Antarctica as well and doing climbs in Antarctica, and that you're just bound to one day. You're not overnighting. You have to try to make as much progress as you can in one day, and then it's back to the ship. I hadn't thought about that before, but it's such a limiting factor. I mean, it's still cool that you can do it, but it's sort of like you're limited in what you can attempt at any given point in terms of climbing, right?
Yeah, in time. And I mean, also back in the early days when things were still reasonably cold, we used to do a lot more ice climbing. So we would do, we did climb on grounded icebergs from time to time, as long as they were grounded. But we also would climb on ice cliffs that we wouldn't go near now.
Yeah.
You just can't.
Yeah.
It's just silly. But it was a bit different then.
For sure. Well, I only have a couple more questions, I promise.
Okay.
We still have a couple of really interesting elements of your experience down there that I don't want to miss asking you about. And one of them is the fact that you were involved with the production of Happy Feet. And it's no surprise, of course, you have this extensive journalism career. You've been guiding and mountaineering in the polar regions, and you know a lot of amazing people. So I'm not surprised that you ended up as part of the Happy Feet team, but I would love to know how that actually came about, and then also what kind of adventures did you get up to during the film's production?
Okay. Well, remember I was talking about when we had the big waves hitting the ship, and my daughter
Mm-hmm.
was in the room with some friends. One of the people in that room was a good friend of mine named Bill Miller, and I had met him through mutual friends in Australia. And we hit it off. He's a great guy. His brother is George Miller, and George Miller is, I would almost call him the father of modern cinematography. He's clearly Australia's most renowned and awarded film producer, and he was responsible for really, kickstarting the careers of people like Mel Gibson back in the day, and Nicole Kidman, and a few others. And so he'd already won an Oscar for Lorenzo's Oil or something, and he had done Babe, the film about the pig and all that. And so he's
Mm-hmm.
really, just incredible background. Anyway, we were talking on that trip, and Bill and I, and we went to Oster with these beautiful emperor penguins and their chicks, and Bill was saying, he said, oh, like a David Attenborough series was, I forget whether it was, Life in the Freezer or something, one of the early ones. And he was saying George saw this documentary series and he was so impressed with the courage of the emperor penguin. The males having to sit there looking after the egg all winter in the darkness and the storm and all this stuff, and the females going out to get fish, and the whole thing, the whole story is fantastic. And he said, I said, oh, that's interesting. He said, yeah, he'd like to make a film about emperor penguins. And so that was that. Anyway, about a year later, he said, look, George actually wants to progress this idea, and would you be interested in coming in and sitting down as somebody who knows Antarctica, and just be there. And also Gary Miller, who was one of the naturalists, he got invited. And we went to this fantastic multi-day sort of confab where we had some great had some great comedians, Australian comedians, guys like Andrew Denton and Flecko, and these guys in Australia. These names, they mean something here, and we had a wonderful time. And George was coming up with ideas, and in our minds, we kind of saw something that eventually would become like March of the Penguins, like a serious documentary about the life of the emperor penguin, and that's what we were kind of believing, and that whole thing was kind of proceeding. Anyway, I went back and I was just finishing up at Australian Geographic, and Bill said, "Look, George is wondering whether you'd be interested in coming in and just helping with logistics, like filming in Antarctica and that." And I said, "Yeah, that'd be great." So I went in and I started working. That was my first job, with my own little consultancy, was to go in and try and do the logistics for this. Well, I ended up putting together a slideshow about the different shooting locations around Antarctica. And George had a look at it, and then he said, who took the pictures? And I said, I did. And he said, do you shoot moving pictures? I said, yes, I used to. So anyway, he said, oh, would you be interested if we get this thing going and sort of managing all the, the filming in Antarctica and putting together the teams and things to do that? And I said, yeah, absolutely. So, but at the time, we didn't have a budget for it, and we weren't really going anywhere because they were working on another Mad Max film, and it was right during the start of the Iraq War. And Warner Brothers, I think it was the studio, came to George and he said, look, we don't really want to do this movie about, guys getting killed in the desert when they're young American troops doing that. And so he said, yeah. And then they said, you don't have anything that's more sort of family friendly. And he said, yeah, I got this thing about a penguin, So suddenly we had the green light, and suddenly we started to understand that this was not what we thought, that this was actually going to be an animated film, and that it was going to be not so much, we were not going to go down to film penguins, we were going to go down and gather data to be used to make a computer world. And so that was how I got involved, and we ended up doing 2 months in late winter, early spring out of Scott Base in the Ross Sea, and then we did another couple of months over off a small Kiwi boat called Braveheart with a fantastic, this old Bell 206, and I forget, it was a little bubble helicopter eventually, and shooting stuff over there in the Weddell Sea and all the way down to Alexander Island, way deep on the peninsula, and it was really, really interesting because we were not only, we were not only taking pictures and shooting all sorts of film and digital. It was at a time that it was going digital from film, but we were also using things like these massive laser scanners that could scan a grounded iceberg. It would take us a whole day to drag it around and shoot all that. And we had things we could take, scanners we could take into ice caves and do 360-degree scans of the ice just to get the shapes. And the Kiwis were fantastic. They gave us fantastic support. Only 4 of us went down and worked that side of things. And we got all the way up into the Transantarctic Mountains, and it was wonderful. We shot amazing ice, we sea ice that had been, pressure ridges that nobody had seen before and things. So it was great.
That sounds like so much fun.
That was fun. That was serious fun. It was serious fun.
And just to be completely away from the world, you're completely away from the modern world and modern communications, just out in nature, collecting data, doing these scans, taking pictures, taking video. I can't imagine how freeing and sort of wonderful that must have been. And I mean wonderful in the sense of full of wonder.
Oh, it was definitely full of wonder. I mean, it was. Look, I mean, the conditions we were working under were, it was cold.
Yeah.
I mean, we had, like anything colder than -30, you really couldn't, it didn't matter how many, little warm packs you had in your camera gear with the scanners or stuff. You just literally things just stop working, So,
Yeah.
you stay in camp for those days. But aside from that, it was, no, it's a real privilege to do that. And again, we had a great bunch of people working. I think that's, if I can just say that, I think I'm one of the luckiest people because I have been so fortunate to work with such great people. And it has continued, on my, all of my expedition leading stuff. The only reason I remember Dick Smith, he was a great mentor for me. He was amazing. And I used to watch because he's an incredibly successful businessman, but he's also been an incredibly successful adventurer. He was the first person to fly a helicopter solo around the world, and he was the first guy to fly a twin otter around the world via the South Pole and the North Pole.
Wow.
And he's flown a helicopter against the wind. He's a great aviator. His polar flights were done initially were done with a wonderful guy by the name of Giles Kershaw, who was one of the great polar aviators of sort of my age group, incredible guy. And sadly, he died on the peninsula in a gyrocopter accident.
Oh.
It was very unfortunate. But anyway, Dick was great. George Miller was great, but just all the people I work with, and even up until COVID, the last trips that I did, and I'm still I'm meeting new people, new generation coming along, and they're fantastic. It's just I think that's the thing that really keeps me excited about new expeditions and where we're going.
Yeah.
Where things are changing, things are different now, but it's nice to see these young people coming in and just doing things differently, but doing them better. It's like I like it.
Yeah. It is definitely. I mean, I'm certain that's changed dramatically. And given that you are one of the handful of people that have spent 3 decades working extensively in the polar regions, on that note, can you give us a little bit of a retrospective and talk about your sort of the impressions that you have of the industry then versus now?
Okay. It's interesting because it's easy to kind of fall back and say, oh, well, back then, we had smaller ships and, now they're more, they're bigger than that. But, that's not entirely true. Like Klebnikov, we take 96 passengers and, Vavilov was, 80, 90, and Marina Svitaiva, we had 110, so the size wasn't that different from what we've got today. What we've got today is we've got so many more ships. It's we've got so many more ships trying to go into the same space. And a few years ago, this is before we had the wonderful people at IATO who did put all the effort into giving us software that made changes of schedule more sane. I mean, I remember sitting in front of my laptop, or not my laptop, but whatever the computer was on the ship, and spending 3 hours just watching. It was like watching the stock exchange, watching everybody change their schedules and the whole thing. And I just, at that point, I just thought, I don't want to be sitting in here doing this, But because we were a small team, everybody did everything, So you'd put in that share, your share of time, and it was incredibly painful. And now it had to get better because even now, there are so many more ships, and they're bigger, and they're putting more people out, and they're trying to do more things, and it's yeah. I think that for the naturalists, I think the historians, I think it's different now because you used to be able to go. God, I don't even want to say that. That's really annoying. When we used to do this, we used to do that. The experience, I think, depends on the people you're with, and where you're going.
Yeah.
And whether, but for me, the thing that has always been important has been the flexibility that's been given to us because of time. And what's happening now with the more people going ashore, it reduces the time you can spend with people on shore or in a Zodiac cruise. You know, like there are some ships now going down there where they think it's okay to do a 40-minute Zodiac cruise, and that is the morning excursion, you know? Because when you go back on the ship, you got, you know, all these things, you know, you can go and have a spa, you can go have a sauna, you can go do all of these things that aren't really Antarctica. They're, you know, they're ship.
Yeah, they're cruise things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a cruise thing, and that's it. And I guess, you know, I guess for me, I think what I like in watching, for instance, with Aurora, watching how they have endeavored with the Greg Mortimer. It's funny, this is the ship, not the man, but they, you know, to see how they have, you know, they're striving to, you know, keep that, you know, to keep that sense of connection with Antarctica, with the place as the priority.
Yeah.
Rather than the ship. Polar Pioneer, for instance, you know, just saying that is, you know, that's, you know, what you guys are doing is exciting because, you know, you've got a ship that's, you know, I know very well, and you're going for a size, you know, you're going for a small group, a true small group. I mean, I burn when I see, you know, 250 passenger ships talking about small ship cruising, you know.
Yeah.
It's like that's not a small ship cruise, you know.
No, not in Antarctica anyways.
No, it's not. Not anywhere.
No.
And so I guess for me, it, you know, it's you know, that's the thing, and that's the challenge. The challenge for expedition leaders is how do you give them that experience where they're connecting with Antarctica, and it's got to be more than walking up a flag line at Cooverville, where you've got a naturalist standing in one place for 4 hours and repeating the same spiel. Do you know what I mean? That's. I'm sure I'll have people who will come back immediately and say, "Oh, but you know, it's only because you've experienced the other thing that this is, you know, that you're devaluing this." And maybe that's true. Maybe it is true. Maybe I am doing that. So you have to be careful because people come back from those experiences ready to sign on with another trip with that company because they've had the most wonderful experience in their life. And it is 20 minutes on a flag line in Cooverville, you know.
Yeah.
So you can't really knock it. But speaking from the other end, you know, the other end of this, the equation, which is you and I and the people who work there, you know, it's quite a different. And I know that we're not the people paying, and I know that we, you know, appreciate the guys who make it possible for us to have these experiences. But anyway, I hope, you know, I hope that, you know, I wish everybody all the best, and I hope that they find ways to allow people to connect with the place.
Yeah.
Because in the end, that's what it's about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, in fairness, I did put you in that position of asking about, you know, industry then versus industry now. And it's just the truth. We did used to have a lot more time and a lot more space and a lot fewer ships to compete with. It's just the reality of it, right? And you fell in love with the place at a time where time wasn't as nearly as much of an issue as it is now, you know? And that's not to say that people's experiences on shore or on short Zodiac cruises aren't transformative, but it is just different. You know, things have changed. And the first time I went to Antarctica, I was a passenger, and it was 2010. I had no clue that I would ever end up working as a guide or owning a polar expedition company. I was just a traveler, you know?
Yeah.
And I remember very distinctly that for me, that was a huge piece of it. I mean, I didn't do the kayaking or the camping that was offered. I just did, you know, regular landings and that kind of thing. But the way that the guides and the EL structured our days and the time that we had to be there to connect, to just spend time being in that environment. That's what was most powerful. And I'm so thankful that my first experience was like that. And it was a relatively small ship as well. So I think that very much sort of colored my idea of what I thought was important and incredible about Antarctica. And it's something that stayed with me a lot. So I really understand where you're coming from.
I had an interesting thing happen on the last trip that I did on the Greg Mortimer, and we went down, and we had everything. We weren't paddleboarding, but just about. We had climbing, skiing, snowshoeing, snorkeling, kayaking. I'm sure there was something else. And traditionally with Aurora and probably other companies, if people did the South Georgia crossing or if they did a polar plunge, then we'd make a nice little kind of a cute certificate that we would present to people, And at the end of this trip, we were doing that, and we were handing out these certificates. And at the end, one of the passengers raised his hand and said, "We didn't do any of that. Don't we get a certificate?" And I just felt horrible. I just looked, and it's like, what? I mean, all you did was go to Antarctica and connect in the most, gentle way and the most formative way. And that's what we should be rewarding. Do you know what I mean? It was like, it was I felt bad.
Yeah. It's an eye-opener.
It was a real learning. Yeah. It's like, oh, you mean you're just going and landing and sitting and taking pictures of penguins and seals and elephant seals and watching how life works in Antarctica, and you didn't get a certificate because you didn't have some toy.
Yeah. And just going to Antarctica for most people is the biggest adventure trip they've ever taken. It's huge.
Absolutely. It's huge.
It's massive. It's the biggest bucket list destination, and it is the most important thing. Camping is not the most important thing. Being there is the most important thing, and yeah, it's such a good point. In fact, the last company that I worked for just stopped making certificates altogether. And when people asked for them, we said, actually, we don't print out because it's not really environmentally friendly to be, giving out a bunch of pieces of paper and, using toxic ink and whatnot. So we don't do that anymore. You can download one from our website later on if you want it at home.
Yeah.
And
that's good. That's good.
It kind of mitigated things a little bit. But it is, the point is not losing sight of that we're all there, and that people made it there. It's such a big endeavor. It's far, it's expensive. It's for most people once in a lifetime. It's for most people extremely life-changing, and that's what matters. That's the most important thing. My goodness, Howard, thank you so much for spending so much time with me today and our audience and sharing all of your amazing stories. I've really enjoyed hearing all about this. I'm so excited. I've been waiting for so long to be able to ask you all these questions because, ever since my brother-in-law sailed with you and he came home and said, "You need to interview Howard," I was like, oh, yeah.
God, that's a bit embarrassing because, when working with Dave, up in the Arctic is, that was a gift. And I've never met his twin. I've never met Ricard, and I'd like to sometime. But those guys they're pretty special. They're pretty special. They really are.
I think so too, but I'm really biased. So
yeah, I can imagine. I'll tell you. What was very interesting was watching how David works with the passengers, and he is like everything that we try and teach in PTGA. He just does naturally. The whole way that he briefs people and he talks about place, and he has a thematic approach to whatever he's talking about. I was just going, wow, this is incredible. Anyway, they're great. They're good guys.
I'm sure they're going to hear this and blush and say, "Why did you cut that out of the episode?" But
well, they deserve to be known. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Howard. And you never know, we might find you back here on Antarctic Stories down the way. So, but yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Thanks, Heather. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Antarctic Stories. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you have an extra minute, leaving a rating or review for the podcast will really help us in reaching a wider audience. Antarctic Stories is a production of Twin Tracks Expeditions, a family-run agency of polar guides who have spent the last decade working on polar expedition ships. We bring you unparalleled insider expertise in small ship voyages to the Arctic and Antarctica, and we love sharing our insider knowledge to help you find the perfect ship for your next polar expedition. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or at twintracksexpeditions.com.